If you're watching this video, my guess is you've heard of bluescreen. Even if you're not sure how it works exactly, you probably know that if you put an actor in front of a solid blue background, then you can remove the blue and replace it with a different background. But what if you're filming someone who's wearing blue? How are they able to make a blue costume Superman fly in front of bluescreen?
In 1978.
I guess they used green screen. Well, no, they didn't. And this was before computer compositing. It was all done optically. Which then got me thinking, if film is based on how silver halide crystals react to light, how does colour film actually know which bits of the crystals to darken for which colour? And if Superman was shot on film, then how did TV shows in the same era remove the blue? Doctor Who and weather forecasts weren't using optical printers. Live colour replacement. And hang on, how come most behind the scenes footage shows green these days instead of blue? And I was surprised to learn that Star Trek The Next Generation used orange, and Dune used sound screens. And yes, I wouldn't dare talk about colour matting without also taking time to honour Petro Vlahos and the Sodium Vapour process. In an earlier VFX History video about optical printers, I explained the many stages involved in removing a precise shade of blue from a scene and adding in another background. In a nutshell, through the use of different coloured lights and projecting film onto a second strip, it was possible to isolate one colour and replace it. I'm not sure I fully explained though that there was never one standard process. Movie making in visual effects has always been an ongoing evolution. One film might do things in one way, but then that technique would be improved on for the next movie. That's just worth keeping in mind when I start talking about how things were done. Photographic film comprises thin layers of silver halide crystals. When exposed to light, the crystals darken. The amount they darken is in direct relation to the amount of light. So if you block part of a film cell as it is exposed to light, then the blocked or matted section remains unexposed. If you then invert which parts of the cell are blocked, change the view and expose the film again, you can bring together two images as if they were one. Incidentally, the term matte comes from the Old French for dull or not reflecting light. Honestly, I could spend an entire VFX History video on matte paintings. Let me just scribble that idea down. Instead, I want to focus on how filmmakers moved away from cards and fixed shapes blocking parts of the frame. They did this through the use of chromakey compositing, which is to say processing an image to remove one specific colour. But I can't really talk about how to remove a colour until I can explain how more than one colour can be recorded in the first place. Black and white film works through a process where silver halide crystals react when exposed to light. A camera focuses light onto a film cell, coated in a gelatin emulsion holding the crystals of silver halide. A chemical bath converts the exposed silver halide to opaque silver. Dark parts of an image don't expose the silver halide, so the corresponding crystals are washed away during the development process, leaving only tiny grains of black and silver where the lightest parts of the image were. This results in a negative image. So how can you make a colour version of that? Well, you could record in black and white, but focus through a spinning wheel with different coloured gels. When you play this back through a projector with its own spinning wheel, you get a decent approximation of colour. You're adding colour to a monochrome image. It is an additive process. The most well-known use of the additive process was kinemacolor, invented by George Albert Smith in 1906. And thanks to my last video where I kept saying telecine instead of telecine, I just know I'm going to get corrections in the comments. But I've checked with experts and it's definitely pronounced Smith. You can see the results are not ideal, and relied on mechanical processes working at both ends. What was needed was an approach where different colours were recorded at source, something where black and white images could be recorded separately with each film exposed through a coloured filter. The filters removed part of the light spectrum, making it a subtractive process. The images were then combined together to form a multicoloured image. To record multiple black and white images simultaneously, the solution was 2 strips of film. A beam splitter in a specially designed camera split the light from the image to send part through a red filter and the rest through a green filter. Movies like 1950's The Nevada were shot on 2-colour Technicolor, and the colour reproduction looks strange to modern eyes. These days you'd pay a fortune for that level of teal and orange colour grading, but this was a major leap forward from traditional black and white. Technicolor was the company. Founded in 1914 by MIT grads Herbert Kalmus and Daniel Comstock and mechanic W. Burton Westcott. Technicolor quickly developed a 3-strip process, protected not just by patents, but by the fact that they designed and leased the required cameras and developed the film after shooting. The cameras contained 3 rolls of black and white film. Like the 2-strip cameras, beam splitters separated the light onto the 3 strips. To combine the 3 colours onto a single strip, each strip was soaked in a dye complementary to the colour recorded. It was then pressed against a new strip of black and white film. The dye transferred to the celluloid's gelatin, and then repeated for each colour. It's a remarkably gloopy process for such a delicate product, but it worked. Movie theatres showing Technicolor pictures needed no special equipment, and thanks to Disney's early adoption for 1932's Flowers and Trees, Technicolor was set. MGM used it for live action in a musical sequence in 1934's The Cat and the Fiddle, and 1935 saw the first full Technicolor feature, Pioneer RKO's Becky Sharp. But the colour reproduction wasn't perfect. The dyes followed the CYMK colours rather than RGB, and the beam splitting meant each cell received a third of the light. So studio lights had to be brighter, which meant hotter. Actors in The Wizard of Oz had to drink large volumes of water to stay hydrated, and many complained their eyes were permanently damaged by the bright lights. When studios rented the Technicolor equipment, it came with camera technicians and a colour supervisor, to ensure sets, costumes and makeup didn't exceed the limitations of the system. Dorothy's ruby slippers were originally silver, before colour supervisor and wife of Technicolor founder Natalie Kalmus suggested the change. Technicolor was not the only game in town. Envious eyes at Eastman Kodak also looked to creating colour film. Initially released only in the 16mm Kodachrome home movie format, it was not until 1950 that Kodak eventually released Eastman Color, a 35mm version. A single strip of colour film which the studios could develop for themselves. Actually, the delay in development of Eastman Color was due to an agreement between Technicolor and Kodak. Kodak supplied single-strip colour film to Technicolor under the monopack agreement. It was only at the expiry of this deal that Kodak moved forward with Eastman Color. Eastman Color was developed in secret, including discreetly signing contracts in 1949 with the movie studios. The studios were keen to break Technicolor's monopoly, but everyone needed Technicolor until Eastman Color was ready. By 1954, virtually all Hollywood movies were shot on Eastman Color, and because the studios were developing the negative themselves, Kodak allowed them to call it Warner Color, Metro Color, or Fox Deluxe. Kodak's approach was to lay down layers of silver halide crystals with dyes corresponding to each colour. Silver halide is naturally most sensitive to blue light, so this layer appears first. Actually, there are 2 layers, one with larger crystals which darken quickly, and one with smaller crystals which take more time. Underneath the blue layer, there was a yellow filter, which blocks blue light from continuing to the red and green layers. With the included dyes, each layer actually appears as its complementary colour. So it's the dyes, mixed in with the silver halide crystals, that determine colour reproduction. This is glossing over so much, such as when film is developed, the light conditions it was shot in need to be known so that it correctly exposes the developed strip. If you'd like to know more about the process, look up terms like colour timing, hazeltine, and colour wedges. And thank you to Dan Curry for pointing me in that direction. Yes, that Dan Curry, VFX supervisor for Star Trek The Next Generation through Enterprise. I was able to get in touch with him and he supplied me with some amazing insights. For now, let's just say that film records colours in 3 separate layers, and that the movie industry was used to the idea of beam splitters and separate rolls of film for recording simultaneously. And my video on optical printers talks through the process of how to remove blue from a background and replace it with another scene. Great! So, how did analog colour TV work? Here's the thing, film is an optical process, but analog TV is an electronic system. The same result of moving images, but achieved in an entirely different way. Back before optical sensors were used in TV cameras, analog television worked by firing a beam in a metal plate, coated in photoresistive selenium or lead. The plate was connected to a circuit, taking away the beam's charge. The resistance changed the steady value of the beam, creating a signal within the charge. And this signal can then be transmitted to televisions. The amplitude of the signal determines how bright the corresponding phosphor should be. And that is majorly glossing over the process, but hopefully you get the idea. An electronic signal created by the brightness of each part of an image. So how did that setup transmit colour? It didn't. It couldn't. To get around this limitation, TV cameras tripled up. 3 beams, 3 metal plates, each with a colour filter and 3 signals, one for red, one for green and one for blue. And colour TVs have 3 phosphors, one for red, one for green and one for blue, arranged in a grid. If you remember your colour theory from school, the 3 primary colours when combined make up white, and from any reasonable distance, 3 tiny dots of separate colours appear as a single dot. With each sensor in the TV cameras determining the brightness of each of the colours, the corresponding phosphors could be combined to recreate any colour. But a quick aside, there was another way to make colour television. In 1928, John Logie Baird demonstrated a mechanical solution where a black and white TV recorded images through a spinning disc with alternating red and green-blue filters. Pretty much the same as Kinemacolor. America's CBS trialled colour broadcasts using this idea in 1942, but TV set manufacturer RCA successfully lobbied the FCC to shut down the trials because it wasn't compatible with NTSC. Still, it was used during the Apollo missions. But that's getting off track. Transmitting from one TV camera is all very well, but it makes for pretty dull television. What was needed was a way to cut between TV cameras, and that's what a vision mixer or video switcher does. Multiple signals can be inputted into a video mixer, which sets one signal as the output. The switcher lets you swap another camera's input to be the output. Incidentally, if you're wondering what a TV switcher looks like, it bears a striking resemblance to the Death Star firing controls in Star Wars. Camera signals draws from the top to bottom, left to right, 25 or 29.97 times per second, and to allow those feeds to be switched seamlessly without a rolling jump, the signals need to be synchronized. Even cable lengths can throw this off. But when each camera feed is matching inside the video switcher, you can do some clever things. Instead of just cutting, you can pass through 2 videos in a vision mixer. The primary video signal is dominant. But if you then reduce the strength of the primary signal, it appears to fade into the secondary video. And you don't have to reduce the strength across the whole video in one go. You can drop the signal to part of the image, creating a wipe effect. And remember, these feeds are coming into the vision mixer as 3 separate but combined colour signals. So instead of adjusting the entire image, vision mixers allow you to limit one of the colours. By turning off the blue, any parts of the primary image containing blue would be removed, allowing you to see a secondary feed. Which isn't ideal, as you can see. But what if you turned off just the brightest parts of the blue, cutting off the top part? Any shades of blue in the rest of the image would remain, but anywhere where the image is bright, the primary blue would go. And that gives us Colour Separation Overlay. Bluescreen 1970s style. One of CSO's telltale giveaways was the fringing that occurred around the actors in front of a blue background. This was partially caused by the syncing issue I mentioned before, but also by the quality of the cameras and the lighting used. It seems productions that had time to set up things properly were able to minimise this fringing, more than other shows which just had to get the shot done. It's been really hard to pin down sources. The majority of information I found online I found from operation manuals. If you have any insights, please feel free to post in the comments. I did find one fascinating book about this era, VFX, the history of the BBC visual effects department. One element the BBC pioneered was the use of gears to control two cameras at once. In this way you could have a camera move across a model, while a CSO'd actor apparently walked through it. Pretty neat for 1984's Alice in Wonderland. Why blue and not red or green for analog TV? It's hard to say. Modern digital cameras have their CMOS image sensors arranged in the Bayer pattern, named after its inventor Bryce Bayer at Eastman Kodak. There are other patterns, but they're generally a variation of Bayer's. Ultimately, in a 2x2 grid, one colour repeats more often than the other two, even with the other colour arrangements. I assume green is the repeating colour because so much of our world is green. Wikipedia says that mimics the human eye, without a source though. I suspect if green sensors had cost 10 times more than red sensors, the layout would be quite different. And because there's more green information recorded than blue in digital cameras, there's more colour information to use to determine a good colour key. Which is why productions recorded digitally will often use green backdrops, while movies using film continue to use blue. But any colour can be used, and maybe there's a better way which got lost in time? Remember earlier when I talked about Technicolor's colour film cameras that use multiple reels of film and beam splitters? Seriously, it was like 5 YouTube ad breaks ago. With optical printers, separating out the blue involved overnight delays, as the film used in the intermediate steps had to be developed. And often, these midpoints would need to be redone if the matte produced wasn't solid enough. These intermattes are black and white images, by the way. Imagine if you could record the black and white matte at the same time as you recorded your actor. Suddenly the whole process would be sped up by days. That's what Disney's Petro Vlahos probably imagined. He took one of those old Technicolor cameras and replaced the beam splitter with a unique prism.
I said, why don't I go right into the middle of the visible spectrum? And there I found a double line, which is the sodium line. And it's only less than a millimicron wide. And so I said, well, now if I can split that off, then I would have a perfect matte.
The prism was actually developed by the J. Arthur Rank organisation and first used in their movie Plain Sailing in 1956. The prisms were then licensed to Disney. I think it's probably fair to say that thanks to Technicolor, movie productions were used to multi-reel cameras and beam splitters. And while the prism was revolutionary, it looks like there were multiple people working towards the same goal. If you remember your school physics lessons, prisms deflect light differently based on the wavelengths of the light as it passes through them. That's why on a sunny day your windows make rainbows, and prisms make for iconic album covers. The amount of deflection of light is also determined by the material of the prism. Mix in Didymium, which itself is a combination of praseodymium and neodymium, and you can create a very special prism, which only deflects one specific wavelength of light, while the rest of the light passes through unaffected. That wavelength is 589 nanometers, which happens to be the colour of light given off when you pass electricity through sodium. Provided you could ensure the background was sodium yellow-orange, you could record your actors dressed in any other colour and get a perfect key. Most famously, the Sodium Vapour process was used in Disney's Mary Poppins and Hitchcock's The Birds, but it remained in use until the late 1980s. I was fortunate enough to speak to VFX artist, Steadicam operator and YouTuber Rusty Geller, who used the prism for the 1983 movie Something Wicked This Way Comes.
And we did a lot of blue screen at Disney, and they had the biggest darn blue screen you'd ever seen. It must have been, I don't know, 25 feet high, and maybe 40 feet wide, 30 feet wide. I mean, it almost filled the whole end of the studio, and it was all fluorescent tubes inside. Because when you did blue screen, it had to be a real even blue all the way across the field. The DP would be out there, and the gaffer would be out there with a spot meter reading the entire blue to make sure it had the same value all the way across, because it was a photomechanical process. You couldn't just dial it in like dial it out like you can green screen. You had to be able to pull a mat off of it. But sodium is much more forgiving. Blue is a rather broad part of the light spectrum, whereas sodium is a real narrow part. The sodium light, it's a yellow light. So that was half the system, was this awful yellow light, and they would put a big backing up, and then they would foreground light the actors in front. Okay. The other half of the system was the camera. Rank in England had come up with the idea of the sodium vapor process, and Disney had it licensed. They didn't own it. It was licensed from Rank. And we had two of these. There were three prisms, I think, made, and I believe Disney had two of them. And what you did is, instead of the YCM prism that you put in the Technicolor 3-strip, they had modified it to 2 strips of film. They put this prism in it, and it had a Didymiun filter. I don't know why I remember that, but it had because it's fun to say, Didymiun. It had a Didymiun filter, and it split out just the sodium light. And so you had your color negative on one strip, and then plus X black and white film on the other side that got just the yellow light, and you got a silhouette map. And the beauty of it was, since sodium light is such a narrow part of the spectrum that you could see through hair, whereas with blue screen, it had a tendency to blotch. If there was hair or lace or something like that, you had to be really careful, because it would kind of get blotchy. And then when you did the put together, you would see kind of the matte line. It would look like it was chewing a little bit. So the scene we were doing was that actress looking at herself as a young woman in a mirror. So they wanted to not just have like a split screen, but actually have them overlap. And that's what we used it for. It was a real treat. I'd heard about this, and there was a real strict protocol, because this prism was very rare, and they couldn't make it. They said, "Oh, the guy who made it died, and and he'd never ever do it again." So the protocol was two assistants from the process lab were to be with this thing at all times, and it was issued to us, and it was a big deal. And they unlocked this big locker, and they gave us this steel box, and the two of us carried the steel box across the studio to the stage where this was set up, and carefully set it into the Technicolor camera and threaded up the film. I was the second guy there for the protocol, to make sure that there was always somebody with it. So one guy went to lunch, the other guy could babysit the prism in the camera. Meanwhile, the gaffers had lit this thing, and it was just all the old gaffers, because they're the only ones who knew how to use the sodium thing, and the old grips, and they knew how to set this thing up. And we set it up, and we shot this thing.
Rusty has had an incredible career. As well as his time at Disney, he worked alongside Linwood Dunn, the perfecter of the optical printing process. He went on to become one of the first Steadicam operators. His series, called What's Behind the Eye Behind the Camera on YouTube, is an excellent watch if you'd like to learn more about movie camera operators. In early 2024, Corridor Crew recreated the results using a modern beam splitter developed by Paul Debevic. One thing they highlighted in that video was the lengths they had to go to prevent other light reflecting off the background. That would cause a shift in the colours and render the process useless. If you take humans out of the equation, so that your foreground objects are fixed and able to repeat motions identically, then instead of shooting everything all at once, you can use motion control to repeat both camera moves and model positions. The repeatable part is the big deal here. You could film a model for lights, then a beauty pass, and then for a key. Motion control didn't start with Star Wars. John Whitney Sr. pioneered the technology in the 1960s, and the movie 2001 made use of it in 1968. But it was John Dykstra who nailed the technology. In the early days, a model would be set up on a static stand and lit. The camera would move, not the model. Once processed, it would appear that the model was moving. But by moving the camera instead, VFX artists would only need one light to sell the look of parallel light as if from a star. While you could shoot the model entirely with a blue background, the blue tended to reflect on a model's surface. So for most shots filmed, the background would be black, then a blue background would be dropped in for the key shot. Except not always. VFX expert David Stipes on his blog talks about filming for the 1980s TV series V. The spaceships would be shot just with a black background. When it came time to make them matte, the models would be painted in situ with a white peel coat. They would then be lit with a strong white light and made to stand out from the background. The paint was plastic-like, so it could be peeled off. This would have been fraught with problems, not least the risk of damaging the model. David Stipes went on to work on Star Trek The Next Generation and its sister shows. He spearheaded the use of CGI in TNG. The Next Generation was mainly model work like V before it, and they pioneered their own method to speed up the creation of a matte. In his book The Art of Star Trek by Dan Curry, Star Trek The Next Generation's senior VFX supervisor describes the process they developed with fluorescent orange screens. Gary Hutzel came up with the idea of shooting matte passes with ultraviolet light to illuminate day-glow orange foam core panels. When shot on high-contrast black and white film, the unlit model would appear completely black, while the UV-lit backgrounds would appear pure white. So it doesn't have to be blue. That must be how Christopher Reeve flew through the clouds in 1978 then. Except no. Superman the movie didn't use the sodium vapour process. They used every other trick in the book and invented some new ones. Painting out wires, black velvet backdrops, front projection, where they link the camera's zoom to the projector's magnification. Pretty much anything but yellow screens. Maybe because Superman was filmed in the UK so they had no access to the prism. Maybe there was no money for additional filming in Hollywood. So when they did need to film with a blue screen, the effects team used a turquoise suit. Once the background was removed to create the intermatte and holdout mattes, the original footage was recombined with blue lights to alter the suit back to blue. At the very start of this video, I talked about how visual effects are continuously evolving. Dune's use of sound screens, for example, show that VFX artists are always looking for better approaches. Even Petro Vlahos, he went on to found Ultimatte, which pushed the use of difference keys to create the perfect matte. Those original guarded sodium vapour prisms remained the property of the Rank organisation, which was bought out by a UK TV company called Carlton Communications in 1997. Carlton later was bought out by a larger UK TV company called Granada. The prisms are likely sitting on a shelf, in a warehouse somewhere gathering dust, where they're only recorded on paper documents no one has bothered to digitise. And according to the hype, blue screens may completely disappear, thanks to tools such as on-set virtual production like The Volume. Although, I have seen quite a few comments about this creating a lot of cleanup work. At the heart of visual effects, there's the desire to make something appear real that isn't. And there's another name for that: magic. And the line between magic and visual effects is very thin. As we'll see in the next video in this series, where movie makers have used every trick and then some to convince us a human can transform into something else.